Go ahead, Charlie.
Okay, thank you, Candace, and good morning, everybody. I'm Charlie Lynch. I'm the captain of the Arms and Armor Guides at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's my pleasure today to introduce this presentation from the Philadelphia Museum of Art Weekend Guides. This has been an exchange, a collaboration of presentations on arms and armor collections. Our guides did one a couple of weeks ago, and this is the reciprocal presentation, which the Philadelphia guides will be doing. And some administrative points first. I would ask everybody to please turn off your cameras so we don't see you during the presentation. Similarly, turn off your voices. Please mute. We don't want any background noise. Please put any comments or questions that you might have into the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And if there's time, at the end of those questions, we'll ask people to unmute themselves and ask additional questions. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Candace, but I do want to say first, what a pleasure it has been putting these presentations together. No one could have been more cooperative or helpful than Candace in doing this, and I appreciate it very, very much. So thank you, Candace, and I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and good morning, everyone. I am Candace Applebaum, and I am proud to be one of 7 weekend guides from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who will be providing you with an introduction to the Kienbusch Arms and Armor collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So with that, let's go to the first slide. So when you're at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, if you ever would by chance stop a visitor and ask them about some of their memorable experiences at the museum, you might hear a phrase similar to, well, my favorite part of the museum is, and that they might be referencing the Arms and Armor Gallery at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Next slide. 1 out of every 2 visitors to the museum will spend time in the European Arms and Armor Galleries, the site of a knight in shining armor, on horseback, with helmets, with swords and accessories of battle from long past centuries, continue to pique our curiosity. Today, as I said, myself and 6 other guides from the Weekend Guide program will provide you with a brief overview from some of the outstanding pieces of our collection. Next slide. The principal portion of our collection was brought together by one man, Karl Otto Kretschmar von Kienbusch, a Princeton-educated man who fell in love with the concept of arms and armor. His bequeathed collection is comprised of more than 1,100 objects, including 35 full sets of armor, more than 135 swords, and 80 helmets. By the end of his life, Kienbusch has succeeded in assembling an armory that was rightly classed among the best of its kind formed in modern times and was virtually within the shadow of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Next slide. Kienbusch had a special interest in armor from Saxony. He was a descendant of a Saxon family who owned a Knights Holding manor castle in the Vogtland region of Germany. We have a painting of that castle in Germany there on the right. He was proud to be a part of a long tradition of gentlemen arms and armor collectors dating back to the 16th century. Kienbusch's armory is true to the conception of the ideal 16th century princely armory that was adopted by collectors in the 19th century. Excuse me. Collectors went to great lengths to display their armor in appropriately Gothic surroundings in emulation of medieval castles. Next slide. In this slide, we see examples of other wealthy collectors early in the 20th century. Men such as Clarence Mackey, director of the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, there on the right, and millionaire publisher William Randolph Hearst. Their collections rivaled those found in European museums. Take a look at those hallways. Now next slide, please. Around the early part of the 20th century, an arms and armor department existed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The collection curator was Bashford Dean. Dean was an internationally regarded scholar and collector in the field. As friend, teacher, and mentor, Dean became Kienbusch's link to the legacy of the European tradition of arms and armor collecting. Their relationship during World War I helped build Kienbusch's collection. Both Dean and Kienbusch were actively involved with the reintroduction of steel armament and helmets used on the battlefield. We see a picture here of Dean dressed on the right in full battle armor. During the Depression, Kienbusch's livelihood, that of his family business, the Spitzner Tobacco Company, fared better than many businesses. The Depression reduced the fortunes of his competitors and many collections dispersed. Consequently, Kienbusch was able to take advantage of the economic situation because he could still afford to buy. Next slide. As major collectors of armor passed away, their collections were dispersed through public sales, including one in 1945 held on the 2-acre, imagine that, 2-acre 5th floor of Kienbusch department store in New York City. The pieces there were not sold by auction, but were labeled with price tags as store merchandise. This unusual method of art sales was developed to expedite the sale of huge art collections, such as that of William Randolph Hearst. Several pieces of the Hearst armory, pardon me, several pieces of the Hearst armory were acquired by Kienbusch at that Kienbusch sale. Over the next 2 decades, he continued to purchase swords, helmets, and weaponry through his travels and business dealings. Next slide. By the 1950s, von Kienbusch began to entertain overtures by many museums interested in his collection. Early in 1963, Kienbusch described the collection as bulging the walls of his modest home on East 74th Street in New York City. To highlight the importance of his collection, he commissioned a catalog from an international team of scholars to document his collection. He'd witnessed the dispersal of several arms and armor collections of his predecessors and wanted his collection to remain together. In 1974, he approved the indefinite loan of 165 pieces to the specifically designed and renovated armor galleries of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Next slide. After nearly 70 years of collecting and 2 decades of negotiating and planning with the museum, Kienbusch was happy to see his collection receive their due during his lifetime. His collection was bequeathed in 1976. This bequest established the Philadelphia Museum of Art as one of the top arms and armor collections in the world, and in terms of quality, as second in the United States only to that of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In closing, I'd like to show you a piece purchased in 1969. We see that piece captured here in this photo inset on the right. Next slide. This suit of armor on the left was special to him, as it was one of a set of 7 suits commissioned in 1612 by the wife of the Prince Elector of Saxony for her husband and his friends to wear at the baptism of the Prince Elector's son. The full set is shown here in the small inset photo near the top. The details and construction of this armor are indicative of the quality of the Kienbusch's choices, his purchase, and his collection. I'll now turn this presentation over to Barbara Schotel, who will tell us about body armor and its early progressions and protection. Barbara?
Thank you, Candace, and good morning, everyone. I am Barbara Schotel, as Candace said. Today, we look at the making, production, and evolution of armor. Slide, please. From the early Middle Ages through the Renaissance, there were dramatic developments in how armor was made and how elaborate it became. It was a developing art form that relied on the collaboration of many artists and many genres. The earliest armor was made of a compound-like steel. It was called mail, spelled M-A-I-L. Slide, please. This is an example, this shirt of mail called a hauberk is an example of mail. It was made of individual links of metal which were interlocked and wielded like a chain. We might think of a chain for a bicycle lock. The links were formed into a sheet and were shaped to fit any part of the body. And again, we might compare the fabrication of mail to knitting, dropping stitches to change the shape, cinch it in, adding stitches to enlarge it. Although the openings of each link or holes allowed for air to flow and thus allowed for comfort of a sort for the wearer, and as smart as it might look on a well-proportioned man, after all, this shirt is a bit of a fashion statement, there were practical problems. First, one might be caught in wet weather and mail rusted, affecting the integrity of the mail. Slide, please. Second, the holes made the wearer vulnerable to the weaponry of an enemy. As you can see on the left, we're missing a slide. There we go. Okay, as you can see on the left, which is a close-up of the lower portion of the shirt's right sleeve, there is light coming through the links. A pointed weapon, arrows, swords, and spears, could inflict a life-threatening wound, piercing the vital organs, penetrating the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and so on. We only have to look at a tomb sculpture of a recumbent knight from our very own Philadelphia permanent collection to wonder how one knight might or might not have been protected in battle with armor. Slide, please. This is an effigy of a recumbent. Next slide. I'm going to show you the effigy of a recumbent knight. There we go. Of a recumbent knight from the Abbey of Saint Marie in Normandy, France. It's dated 1230 to 1240. The figure was carved in limestone by an unknown artist and depicts a man that was a knight. Now we know that because of how the sculpture carved the man's clothing or armor to look like mail. Next slide. Notice there we go. Notice the ribbing effect of the garment around the upper left arm, visible here in the lower left image. Looking at the opposite image on the lower right, we see the knight's neck and head. The hauberk has a hood, and it is draped from below his chin. See what looks like almost a cowl neck, and it's going to the back of his collar and lays on the pillow. This would be laced up during battle to protect his face. Over his suit of mail, this knight wears a sleeveless robe. It's called a surcoat. This would allow a knight to shade their armor from the hot, brutal sun during battle or traveling on a journey. Next slide. A coat of arms or symbols were designed on the surcoat for purposes of identification. When in the heat of battle, with one's face concealed, a knight had to know who was approaching. I'm going to repeat that sentence. When in the heat of battle, with one's face concealed, a knight had to know who was approaching. Was it friend or foe? And obviously vice versa. Like the surcoat, this sculpture has 6 small black birds carved in relief. This addition may have linked him to a specific French family and was for identification. So mail armor was beginning, but further protection was needed. Armor is reinforced with intertwined strips of leather, but that was insufficient. And then highly carbonized iron was used. It was more malleable and more durable, but it was complicated. A complicated process with unanticipated chemical issues discovered along the way. Scientists were also involved. A big advance came when armorers created plate armor. It could cover the whole body and was impenetrable. Let's take a look at a sophisticated version of full body plate armor. Next slide. This man armor was made for use on horseback in the field. It was made over 500 years ago and in 1505 by German armorer Mattes Deutsch. Deutsch was well known in the area of Bavaria where he lived. This man armor is a rich and complete example of his surviving works. It is constructed of steel plates that fit tightly together and thus provide protection in battle. The breastplate is struck with Deutsch's armorer's mark, as well as with the inspection mark, indicating its high quality. Next slide. Down the center of the breastplate are traces of etched and gilded flowers and foliage. In the middle, you see a close-up. Although details are difficult to see because of its age, as well as the best image we could find under the circumstances of today, this body armor was created for a man whose height was just under 6'3", a tall man. And of course, the bigger the man, the more armor he had to wear and the more weight he had to carry. So we see that the design and production of armor involved a great collaboration of artisans, including designers, armorers, scientists, metalworkers, and then there were the decorators, engravers, embossers, gilders, painters, and etchers. Making armor was labor intensive. It was time consuming and required great skill, and therefore was very expensive. It was the nobility and the landed gentry who commissioned the making of armor and who wanted to protect their property and oftentimes themselves, and also had to protect their soldiers and knights who were in their employ. As for decoration, there was nothing like being able to show off your armor, which resulted in often elaborate markings and designs. But there were other issues to consider in addition to protection. Key issue, flexibility of the armor, mobility for the wearer, all of which was compounded by the weight of the armor. In this case, by the way, this man armor weighs 58.5 pounds. The knight also had to maneuver himself and his horse. So a solution came up, and that was a key element. It was hinges. We can see that on either side of the breastplate. If you look on the left side image, the rivets attaching the layers of plate armor and the hinges allow for the man to move his shoulders, raise his arms, as well as his elbows. Next slide. We can see the same concept allowing movement with hinges from head to toe. With hinges, he'd be able to bend his knees and move his wrists. That was important, especially if he were wielding a weapon. Yet, believe it or not, other issues remain to be solved. A man wearing armor must be able to breathe and to see, quite critical. And we see that ability in the headpiece or helmet. Next slide. The construction of the headpiece or helmet is hinged well to be raised when needed. You can see that just above where the ears are, our left, his right, and notice the vents or slits in the steel covering the face. I count 5 of them. This allows for visibility and breathing. Our knight can see and he can breathe. In conclusion, unlike mail armor, plate armor covered the knight head to toe and gave protection. And at the same time, it is truly a work of art. Today, we recognize armored knights as heroic soldiers, protectors, warriors, and competitors. But there's also a romantic notion attached to them. Perhaps it is because it is in our imagination to wonder, and of course to embellish, who or what is under there, hidden behind all that steel. I hope you will join me today in bidding a fond farewell to my knight. Well, no, let's make that now it's our knight in shining armor. And now we turn to see what armor might be created to carry our knight into the field. And Alicia will tell us all about it.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Alicia Romeu, and I would like to share our horse in armor. Next slide, please. The recumbent knight that we have just seen may have ridden this horse. This horse armor, dated 1507, is the only surviving horse armor by Wilhelm von Worms, a famous armorer in Nuremberg. It is well documented piece that could be considered a movable art, a sculpture. The armorer constructed anatomically shaped defenses that were both functional and stylish. To own this piece represented wealth, power, authority, and sophistication for its aesthetic qualities. On the next slide, you will meet the owner of this horse. He was Duke Ulrich of Württemberg, who ruled from the late 15th century to the middle of the 16th century in Germany. He commissioned this armor for his war horse in anticipation of riding along, next slide please, Maximilian I of Austria from Germany to Rome, where Maximilian was going to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Julius II. Next slide. To accomplish this, the workers in Wilhelm von Böhm's shop combined the skills of a tailor to get the correct measurements, the mastery of metal working, where armorers specialized in a particular part of the armor, and artists who drew, etched, and gilded the designs. The armor protected the horse without impeding movement. Notice the rounded form of the rump, constructed in heavy plates that were heated up and shaped, and then the pieces were attached with brass rivets. You can see the slight flaring away from the horse's body at the lower part of the skirt, with a rounded finish for strength. The armor was practical. The rump piece was attached to the neck defense and the headpiece with leather straps on the saddle. The neck headpiece was designed with slats like a lobster tail that would allow for movement of the head. Notice the head defense. There is ample space between the metal plate and the jaw and mouth, so the horse could breathe easily. The naturalistic shape of the earpiece, so the horse could move his ears. And the eyes were well protected also. Next. It shows sophistication. The plate armor surface allowed for etching, engraving, and gilding, and the ornamentation shows quality of design and execution. It is thought that the drawings made by Albert Dürer, on the right side of the slide, were the inspiration for these images of noble women placed on the flank charts or the side panels. Next, please. Since surfaces of the steel were cleansed with sand and urine to prevent rust, this abrasion caused partial loss of some of the original etchings and gildings. But one can see the women who surround the side panels while holding banners with the Duke's motto, which was Ich habe in Sinn, which means I have in mind. The meaning of the mottos not known only to the owners of the piece. Next slide, please. And you may still see the details bordering the skirt. They show a hunting scene because it was Duke Ulrich's favorite pastime. And given the opportunity to see it more closely, you can see the crossbow mentioned in your presentation last week. Next slide, please. The best preserved design is on the front of the horse's face, a dragon, with its tail going up the forehead. Next slide. You can see the clear detail of the body of the dragon, the folds of the skin, the pores, and even hairs. It was meant to cause fear. Next. Once the piece was finished, and before it was polished, it would have to pass inspection to verify that all specifications had been completed. When this happened, the steel plate was struck with the armorer's and the owner's mark, which you can see in the close-up on the left side of the chevron or the headpiece. Next slide. Because the Republic of Venice refused to grant safe passage to Rome, the planned journey never took place. Maximilian was crowned in Aachen, and his dynasty, the Habsburgs, lasted until 1918. On the other hand, Duke Ulrich had been involved in conflicts and he was exiled. So he sent his 4-year-old son, Christopher, to Maximilian's court, where he spent his childhood as part of the imperial house retinue. There he gained political experience under the Habsburgs' tutelage, and most likely, he learned to wear armor at an early age. And now, Barbara Moll will talk about armor for children.
Next. Good morning. Children grow quickly and armor was expensive. So why would armor be made for a boy who would likely soon outgrow it? Why would a boy even need armor? And which boys received it? Next. Generally, only the son of a knight, lord, a wealthy merchant, or someone who held title and position in the court of the king or a lord was allowed the opportunity to become a knight. Well, would a child of 7 likely be involved in a military competition, such as a foot tourney or tournament over the barriers? Well, if he was selected to become a page, the first stage in becoming a knight during the 1500s, then it was likely he would partake in this common sporting challenge to begin practice for inevitable warfare as an adult knight. Usually a long bar was erected the length of the field, and the boys on foot approached each other on opposite sides of the barrier. The barrier would ensure that the competitors did not collide head-on as they practiced fighting with blunt-ended short spears, poleaxes, maces, or swords. The armor for this sporting event was quite specialized: a closed helmet that locked onto and rotated on the gorget or collar, and asymmetrical pauldrons, shoulder defenses, that provided maneuverability and protection. Note that this armor weighs almost 14 pounds. That's about 1/3 the weight of an average 7-year-old. But knowing how to fight on foot for both sieges and when unhorsed was a necessary skill for combat. Next. Until the age of 7, these boys of noble lineage, such as Marcantonio II Borghese, learned manners and basic literacy from their mothers or female relatives. Beginning at the age of 6 or 7, the boy would leave his home and report to the castle or manor of a king's lord, baron, or knight to begin his training in the basic skills needed to become a well-rounded and educated military commander. As a page, for about 7 years, he would be taught such skills as the fundamentals of court life, martial arts, table manners, care and maintenance of armor and weapons, learning of board games like chess, how to care for a horse, how to read and appreciate music, or even play the lute, how to hunt, and how to hawk. After learning the basics of combat, he might even accompany his lord to war to offer minor support functions. Next. It is exceedingly rare to be able to identify the former owner of a piece of children's armor, let alone own a piece. This highly decorated back plate most certainly belonged to the boy we just saw in the last picture. His uncle became Pope Paul V, from 1605 to 1621, and his father was appointed by the Pope as the commander of Castel Sant'Angelo in 1609. So why would such an elaborate decoration, including both gold and silver overlay, be made for a young boy? To demonstrate the rank and status the boy would assume in adulthood. An oval medallion in the upper part of the central band gives us the biggest clue to its owner. It's a reference to Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress outside Vatican City. It features the Archangel Michael sheathing his sword above a three-towered castle as a sign of the end of the plague in 590, thus giving the castle its present name. Next. Military men by the early 1600s required munition-grade body defenses in a society with almost constant wars. Thus, armorer's art was in decline in favor of practicality. Members of high nobility continued to commission some decorative armor, including these exceedingly well-crafted pieces from a rare ensemble: an open face helmet, a gorget or neck piece, and a breastplate fitting a 3 or 4-year-old. Next. The outside surface may have originally been either an iridescent blue or a brownish violet hue, with bands of trophies in a difficult etching technique called goldschmelz, where the motif itself, not the background, is etched into the metal surface. Next. At the age of 14, the page would graduate to become a squire, where he would serve a knight both on and off the battlefield. By 21, if the squire had proven his bravery and skill in battle, he may ultimately be awarded a knighthood by a leading lord, where he would lead a life prepared for combat. Becoming a knight was a serious vocation that a boy spent his entire childhood observing and constantly improving as an adult. Only the very rich could afford the requisite weapons, armor, and war horse of a knight. Working for the Spanish monarchs, the craftsman featured next by Magdalena Padilla is known for his highly desirable decorations made on firearms and edged weapons.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. My name is Magdalena Padilla, and I'm presenting this morning on a saber created by Eusebio Zuloaga, the most famous Spanish metalworker of mid-19th century, renowned for his use of the artistic technique damascene in guns, pistols, and edge weaponry. Eusebio was born in 1808 into a family that worked in gun making as far back as 1596. We see here a picture of Eusebio seemingly looking at his saber, scabbard, and the case in which they rest. Next slide, please. Eusebio made this saber with its scabbard and case in 1849. The dimensions are quite impressive. The case is a little over 3 feet long, necessary to house the saber and scabbard which are almost equally as long. Although this work by Eusebio consists of 3 parts, the saber, the scabbard, and the case, the focus of this presentation is only on the saber. Next slide, please. We are able to appreciate Eusebio's Damascene technique when we study the parts of the saber, looking at the pommel, the grip, the guard, and the blade. By viewing these 4 areas of the saber, we see the gold and silver interplay Eusebio was famous for in his use of Damascene. Throughout all 4 areas, we see silver swirls of arabesque designs, and in a background of smooth gold, we also see structural forms. First, in the pommel and the guard, we see what appear to be animal motifs. In the grip, we see a soldier dressed in armor with a shield at his feet. In the blade, we see more figures that have a great deal of detail and purposefully conjure images of mythology as well as battle. We can see here the image of a swan and a female. Let's look at her more closely. Next slide, please. Here we see a silver female figure with her head in profile and her round breasts, her shoulders, hips, and legs facing us directly. She has placed her arms on the slender neck of a silver swan, who is also in profile, but its left wing is embracing the female. Their silver image is framed against an inlay of gold. In another part of the blade, we see a bouquet of various silver armaments, inclusive of flags and various edged weapons held together by a shield in the center of the collection over a smooth inlay of gold. We also see a male soldier standing in profile in armored gear and holding a weapon as he stands over his vanquished enemy and holds his gold and silver shield for us to admire. Next slide, please. Eusebio achieved these visual expressions in steel using the art of Damascene, which is a decorative technique of inlaying metals into steel to create various designs. It was used in Greece, Japan, Spain, as well as Syria. The English term Damascene, in fact, comes from the technique's perceived resemblance to artistic patterns produced during the Middle Ages in Damascus, Syria. We also see here on the slide to the right that Damascene involves indenting the iron surface, then pressing gold wire into the surface so that the gold forms a solid shape. Whereas modern Damascening uses acid etching, the Zuluagas used only hand tools to create the indentations. Next slide, please. What is the provenance of this work? And what is the legacy of Eusebio Zuluaga's artistic tradition? At the time Eusebio made this work in 1849, he was already in service to the Spanish queen, Queen Isabella II, whose picture we see here. He remained in her service for several decades in various leadership positions, including as her royal armorer. That was until 1868, when she was dethroned. 10 years later, in 1878, The work here was seen in auction at Christie's in London, sold by an anonymous seller. 20 years later, in 1898, Eusebio dies. By that time, the Zuluaga family, through the efforts of Eusebio's son Placido and his grandson Ignacio, had applied their artistic skills beyond weapon making. Eusebio's son Placido became known for perfecting the Damascene technique and expanding it into sculpture and other metalwork. The portrait of Placido here, done by his son Ignacio, shows him holding, however, an edged weapon. In Ignacio's self-portrait, also shown here, he shows himself in contrast with an artist's palette. The saber, the scabbard, and the case came to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1977, bequeathed by von Kienbusch, who had purchased it in 1961. To continue our ongoing discussion on the Kienbusch collection, I turn to my colleague, Tom Lowe, for his presentation on helmets.
Our collection offers a broad and interesting look at helmets, both in Europe and around the world. I would like to introduce you to 3 of our earlier European helmet types in our collection. These 3 helmets offer our visitors an interesting view on the changes that occurred in the earlier developments in the helmet: the bassinet, the barbut from Italy, and the sallet. The period between the late 13th century and the early 15th century was marked by constant warfare. Also during this time, innovations in armor equipment was changing rapidly, shifting away from mail to a greater use and development of plate armor. The bassinet helmet became the most common type of head defense throughout Central and Western Europe. This bassinet is especially rare. Excavated in France, this helmet's condition suggests a connection with the Franco-English conflicts known as the 100 Years' War. This is a rare and important steel plate helmet that has survived from the 14th century. Despite its age and condition, it continues to reveal very sophisticated workmanship. For example, the helmet's thickness varies throughout. It is thicker around the crown and towards the front, thinning evenly towards the lower edges. The helmet has numerous small holes bordering the lower edge, showing how an interior lining was secured. Above these holes is a second series of holes, fewer in number and further apart. Some openings retain remnants of a pierced staple used for the attachment of a neck defense, presumably a circular cape of mail extending over the shoulders for additional protection. At the center of the helmet's brow, notice a T-shaped stud fitted for securing a face defense, a detachable, elongated, triangular steel plate just wide enough to cover the nose. Based on research, it is likely this helmet was made by a German or Italian armorer. Around the 1400s, the bassinet type helmets gave rise to this specialized sallet known as a barbut in Italy. A barbut helmet is a visorless war helmet, often made with a distinctive T or Y-shaped opening for the eyes and mouth. This change from the bassinet provided remarkable protection without compromising a user's vision or ability to breathe. It was a style that became ideal for infantry, light cavalry, and naval officers. This helmet is made from a single piece of steel with a gracefully shaped skull rising to a low medial comb. This helmet is often held up as a prime example of sculpture in steel, a formal beauty resulting from functional design. As with most barboots, the edge of the T or Y-shaped face opening is almost always reinforced. Interestingly, this specialized Italian salé design did not become popular outside of Italy. What becomes popular outside Italy, and especially in Germany, is the salé. This collection offers a gold mine in salé helmets. There are over a dozen German salé type helmets in this collection. This particular salé is a showstopper, especially for children, where references to Star Wars is often heard among our guests. During the late 15th century, a golden age of armor making, one of the most numerous head defenses in use was the salé. This helmet style offered access to both the rich and poor. Its design offered great versatility. Forged from a single piece of steel, it was primarily a protective headgear used by lightly armored infantry and archers. It was also a style that allowed for great visibility, and respiration was not impeded. It was also light relative to other helmets, and vision could be enhanced by simply adjusting the tilt of the helmet. Salés do not offer protection of the lower face and throat, but depending on one's needs and financial resources, they could be modified in intriguing ways. The salé could also be made less expensively and rapidly by reducing the amount of time spent on the finish. Helmets made with poor finishes were sometimes creatively painted with facial features. This salé was made in Nuremberg, Germany around 1470. It is a salé that is highly regarded for its exceptionally clean outlines and well-balanced proportions. Although we know it was made in Nuremberg and struck with a maker's mark, the maker has not yet been identified. In the next 3 slides, I want to briefly show off the broad collection of Italian, German, salé-style helmets in our collection. There are over a dozen. Each one is positioned in chronological order, showing changes from Italy to Germany. Notice the open-faced helmets. Notice the changes in the extended tail. See the Italian style salé with a full visor added. Notice the elegant ways eyes are being protected with the thin opening slits. Also, notice the variations in the delicate medial ridge at the top of the helmets. Notice the length changes of the tail and the variations in the lower curve of the helmet. Notice the elongation that occurs with the tail when it becomes articulated into sections. And notice the salé with a poor finish painted with a face. And finally, look at the iconic shapes of the salés we just looked at. The shapes of the lower rim and the elaborate tails have been highlighted. And is it possible not to see a link to Star Wars? For our next spotlight, we want to share another very unusual head covering. Kara?
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. Next slide, please. As Tom said, this is a different type of head covering. Unlike salés, this head covering is not for a human or for battle. This diminutive object at 2 3/4 by 2 inches can fit in the palm of your hand. So what is this object? Well, it's a falcon hood. And falcon hoods are used to cover the heads of falcons when they are being trained to hunt in the company of humans and to keep them focused during a hunt. They are worn to help the bird acclimate to human beings and to keep the bird in a calm state while sitting on the falconer's glove. But to be clear, the hood is removed from the head of the falcon just when it is let go to swoop in on its prey. Most hoods, like the one seen here, have a plume on the crown, which, as well as being decorative, can be used as a handle to help in the removal of the closely fitting hood. The equipment for hunting provided an opportunity for extravagant display, and this example is no exception. Falcon hoods are used for sport, specifically for hunting. Remember the depiction of a hunting scene on the horse armor that Alethea shared with us? And this particular object was made in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, around 1700. Let me tell you a little bit more about falconry, which is the sport associated with falcons. Raptors are tamed and trained to hunt small game such as rabbits, hares, quail, and squirrels. When falcons are used to hunt, this is called falconry. The falcon is a predator which has a natural drive to hunt. In a hunt, it would be allowed to chase its prey. A falcon will swoop in on its prey with its razor-sharp talons, often killing the prey immediately. Its handler would then retrieve the prey and would possibly have to finish the kill to protect the falcon and be humane to the prey. Next slide, please. Falconry has a long and rich history. Some experts place falconry's origins between 4000 and 6000 BC in Mongolia, but other historians believe that practice could be even older, with its beginnings in Arabia or the Middle East. In Iran, where this object was made, records have been found of a king who may have lived as much as 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, using birds of prey. Beginning in the 6th century and extending through the Middle Ages, the popularity of falconry surged in Europe. Though falconry was originally used for subsistence and not sport, it eventually became the sport for royalty for centuries, with the possession of falcons and other birds of prey considered a status symbol. By the 1600s in England, falconry was so popular it was actually governed by a strict set of customs. By the 1800s, however, the sport began to diminish in popularity in Europe because of the decline of the aristocracy, increased use of firearms to kill animals for food and for sport, and the enclosure and clearing of forest lands for agriculture. However, in North America, interest in falconry began to rise around the turn of the 20th century. Shortly after, the tradition again surged in popularity in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. So we see falconry is not an ancient and fanciful sport of the far past, and in fact, it is still practiced throughout the world today, even in Philadelphia. It is estimated that about 10,000 individuals legally practice falconry around the world, with about 5,000 falconers in North America. As of December 1st, 2020, the average annual pay for a falconer in the United States was just under $52,000 a year. Let's look at this object a little more closely. We can see, based on the materials, velvet and silver, as well as the colors red and gold, and we know that in Persian writing, red typically refers to royalty, that this small object is for somebody important. It was possibly used by somebody of royal origins. Let's look closely at the design. You notice the vines, also called arabesques, with the stylized flowers called florons on this tiny piece. That's typical of Islamic art. You can also see a teardrop shaped opening in the image on the right. That's where the falcon's beak would protrude. Along the bottom, there's the leather band that appears to mimic scaly skin. We see an animal on the left, in the left-hand image, we see an animal face at the end of the leather band, and which is on the back of the hood. It could be a stylized falcon, though it has more bevel than a sharp beak, typical of a falcon. Perhaps it is a reference to the owner or the maker. Most hoods have a plume on the top of the crown, which we see here, As well as being decorative, it can be used as a handle to help in the removal of the closely fitting hood, as I mentioned earlier. Because of people's great interest in falcons and the status of falconry as a royal sport, falcons appear in art throughout the ages and in different media. Next slide, please. I was curious as to whether the Met had a falcon hood in its collection, and it does, but there was no photo on the website. But in my poking around on the website, I discovered this stunning object, and it's the only piece we'll talk about that is not in our collection at the Philadelphia Museum. This is a royal object, and we know that because it has an inscription of the name Teti, who was the first sovereign of the Dynasty 6. A falcon stands proudly at the top, directly behind a rearing cobra whose hood is open. We know that falcons, among other birds, were kept in sacred flocks by the ancient Egyptians, and some individual birds were even elevated to be temple animals. And by the way, I did not mention, but this object is actually a musical instrument. But let's get back to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and see some other works that feature a falcon. Next slide, please. We're going to first start by looking at a woodcut, which is at the far right of the slide. This woodcut is from Japan, made approximately after the falcon's hood, so in the 1800s. We see the falcon majestically perched on his throne, and though tethered, with his piercing eyes and deadly beak and talons. Another falcon object from Japan, this time a decorative sculpture, is shown in the photo in the top center, and it is made from silver. It's more recent, from about 1930 to 1940, and it highlights an enduring interest in falcons. And you can see in the two photos close-ups of the talons of a falcon. They are indeed sharp and deadly. Next slide, please. We'll first look at the shield on the far right. This is also of Persian origin. Based on the date and the materials from which this is made, which are steel and gold, this was likely for parade or for show and probably belonged to somebody wealthy. Like our falcon's hood, the shield features traditional Islamic artistic styles, arabesques, again, scrolling vines, and florons, stylized flowers, and it also shows balance and symmetry, which are typical in Islamic art as well. We see in the small cartouche at the bottom, a falcon with prey in its sharp talons. Perhaps like the Merlet bird we saw earlier when Barbara Chotel talked about the recumbent knight, this might be a reference to its owner's name, or perhaps his status or hobby. And you can see in the photo on that's over the shield as well, a falcon with prey captured in its talons, just like the detail on the shield. On the left side of the slide, we can see an etching, another work on paper, this time from Belgium, and a little bit later in 1883. It's the etching of a falcon in action during a hunt. A falconer is riding a horse, and there are 3 falcons, one on its head, one on its hand, and one in the air, perhaps to show the action of the falcon in pursuit. The falconer, with a gloved hand to protect it from the deadly talons, carries a game pouch around his shoulder. Now let's take a look at a few hunting items. Next slide, please. First, we see on the right-hand part of the slide, a game pouch. It is made from leather and velvet, and it would have been used to carry back small game from the hunt. And this is much like the one shown in the etching, the Arab falconer on the prior slide. It's from about 1675 to 1700, so contemporary with our falconer's hood. And on the left, we see a grouping of objects. It's called a truce, which means kit or equipment. And these are the items that would have been used as part of the hunt. And I'll just go through them from left to right. Buy knife, a file, a sword, a scabbard, and a fork. And we can see the handles are gilded and decorated. And as I mentioned earlier, the equipment used for hunting provided an opportunity for extravagant display, and we certainly see that here. Next slide, please. In another etching, this time from Italy, we see a falconer in a more subdued manner with his lady. Though women rarely wore armor or were involved in battle, they were permitted to participate in falconry and hunts. In fact, these events were often used for secret courting. We see the falconer to the left, and he has the falcon perched on his gloved hand, and you have to look closely, but the falcon is hooded. And on the right is his lady with her back to us. Now let's get back to our hunter and matchmaker, the falcon himself. Let's look at some photos. Next slide, please. I should say himself or herself, because female falcons are fierce hunters. We see again two images of our falconhood on the left, and which has how it looks today in the vitrine at the museum, and then in the center of the slide. And then to the right, we see photos. And the one that's sort of middle of the center of the slide and lower right, you can see the falcon hoods right on a falcon. Get an idea of how they look. So are falcon hoods a modern day fashion statement? Next slide. Well, with Lent right around the corner, we might see similar head coverings on Carnival performers, or maybe we will see falcon hoods at a future Met Gala. That concludes our virtual tour. We'd like to thank you for spending time with us exploring our museum's armor and arms collection, the vast majority of which were gathered by one man. Carl Otto Kretschmar von Kienbusch's lifelong passion for collecting, his depth of experience and scholarship, and Dr. Basford Bean's mentoring helped establish him as the foremost American collector of European arms and armor. Today, we highlighted some of our favorite objects, but we look forward to hosting you and sharing more of the hundreds of other items we did not discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was a terrific presentation. Very, very interesting, very, very informative. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Let's go through the questions in the chat. If I can pull it up. It disappeared on me for a minute. First question actually was mine, and I directed it not to everyone, but to one of our people. In any event, Barbara, the question was, how much does the male shirt weigh that you showed?
58.5 pounds.
58?
58.5 pounds. So just under 59 pounds.
Okay, thank you. Second question, was there a practical purpose to the flares at the shoulder, or was it purely decorative? Alicia, that's for you. On the suit of armor, the shoulders had a flared piece on each side.
Yeah. Alethea?
No, I didn't deal with the armor of the shoulders. I did the horse.
Yeah, that was Barbara Chotel.
It was Barbara Chotel.
I'm sorry, Barbara?
Oh, repeat your question.
The question was for
the questions. I don't see them. Yeah.
The flared piece by the neck in the suit of armor, was that purely decorative, or did it have a functional purpose?
You mean on the shoulders or at the waist?
On the shoulders.
On the shoulders, I believe they are for, and I think that Barbara Mall mentioned that when she was speaking about the children's armor. They are on the shoulder because it was a way of protecting them from someone's sword or weapon.
Okay, thank you. Then next question was from Megan. Was in cleaning the I guess it was the horse armor?
Yes.
It was cleaned with sand and urine. And she says, wow, could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, it appears to be that urine was used not only as a cleanser because it's ammonia, but it was also used in medicine and even in producing gunpowder. Today's cleansers have ammonia. Well, in olden times, pee was collected and even sold because it would be taken to the shops to use as a cleanser. And even in laundry facilities, it would clean stains. So
Okay,
it was a cleanser.
Megan, any follow-up?
I'll keep that in mind next time I drop my red wine on the carpet or something.
Yes. Yes.
My dog can help you.
provoke More
Yes.
research, yes.
Another question from Megan. How rare is or was Zuluaga's technique? It must have been unbelievably difficult.
Well, Eusebio Zuluaga is credited with actually modernizing the technique of Damascene. So he used various tools and achieved certain subtleties that were probably a result of his own skill set and traditions that evolved through his family lineage, since they were involved in weapon making since 1596. But he was the one who elevated the Damascene work in the mid 19th century. His son Plácido is credited with fine-tuning the technique even more, which suggests that within the Zuluaga family, they had developed and maybe improved on some of the tools that prior generations had used. But either way, it just seems phenomenal. I agree. Thank you.
Are people still doing this sort of stuff in Spain today?
The city of Toledo is still known in Spain for doing swordsmanship and working in silver work and Damascening. You'll also see it not just in weapons, but in jewelry. So it's a technique that's gone beyond just weapons.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, although there are many, many comments saying how wonderful the presentation was. If anybody would like to unmute herself or himself and ask another question, please do so now.
Charlie?
Yep. Oh.
I have a sample of Damascene.
Mhm.
I don't know that you can see it.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And it is not weaponry, but as Magdalena said, they expanded to other objects to show their technique. And I'm trying to, I don't know if I can put it, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful example of Islamic art.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, with that, then let me thank you all very, very much for a wonderful presentation. It was very informative. We really very much enjoyed it. And we really very much enjoyed doing this collaboration with you, this exchange. And hopefully we'll be able to do more in the future, and hopefully the not too distant future. So
Okay.
thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. We're going to end this recording, and we just ask that the presenters hang on at the end. I just want to have a little conversation. Thank you so much. Everybody enjoy the snow and be safe and stay warm.
Careful.
You too. Thank you.
Thank
Until
you.
we see each
Thank
other
you.
again.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.